Welcome to Nebula Narratives, your gateway to immersive science fiction audiobooks. If you love epic journeys, alien worlds, and thrilling futures, you're in the right place. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the adventure. And hey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories beyond the stars. Step into the mind of one of science fiction's earliest visionaries, H.G. Wells. First published in 1895, The Time Machine introduced the world to the concept of time travel through the eyes of a brilliant yet enigmatic inventor known only as the Time Traveler. In this groundbreaking novella, Wells doesn't just imagine the future, he dissects it. Journey with the Time Traveler as he leaps thousands of years forward into a strange and distant world where the remnants of humanity have evolved into two distinct and haunting species, the gentle, childlike Eloi and the sinister, subterranean Morlocks. Blending Victorian-era curiosity with philosophical depth, The Time Machine is more than a tale of adventure. It's a sharp critique of social class, industrialization, and the fate of civilization itself. What begins as scientific wonder becomes a chilling look at what may await us in the far reaches of time. This is the story that launched a genre, inspired countless adaptations, and continues to challenge our ideas of progress, time, and the future of humanity. Chapter 1, Introduction. The Time Traveller, for so it will be convenient to speak of him, was expounding a recondite matter to us. His grey eyes shone and twinkled, and his usually pale face was flushed and animated. The fire burned brightly, and the soft radiance of the incandescent lights in the lilies of silver caught the bubbles that flashed and passed in our glasses. Our chairs, being his patents, embraced and caressed us rather than submitted to be sat upon, and there was that luxurious after-dinner atmosphere when thought runs gracefully free of the trammels of precision. And he put it to us in this way, marking the points with a lean forefinger, as we sat and lazily admired his earnestness over this new paradox, as we thought it, and his fecundity. You must follow me carefully. I shall have to controvert one or two ideas that are almost universally accepted. The geometry, for instance, they taught you at school is founded on a misconception. Is not that rather a large thing to expect us to begin upon? Said Philby, an argumentative person with red hair. I do not mean to ask you to accept anything without reasonable ground for it. You will soon admit as much as I need from you. You know, of course, that a mathematical line, a line of thickness nil, has no real existence. They taught you that? Neither has a mathematical plane. These things are mere abstractions. That is all right, said the psychologist. Nor, having only length, breadth, and thickness, can a cube have a real existence. There I object, said Philby. Of course a solid body may exist, all real things. So most people think. But wait a moment, can an instantaneous cube exist? Don't follow you, said Philby. Can a cube that does not last for any time at all have a real existence? Philby became pensive. Clearly, the time traveller proceeded, any real body must have extension in 4 directions. It must have length, breadth, thickness, and duration. But through a natural infirmity of the flesh, which I will explain to you in a moment, we incline to overlook this fact. There are really 4 dimensions, 3 which we call the 3 planes of space, and a 4th, time. There is, however, a tendency to draw an unreal distinction between the former 3 dimensions and the latter, because it happens that our consciousness moves intermittently in one direction along the latter from the beginning to the end of our lives. That, said a very young man, making spasmodic efforts to relight his cigar over the lamp. That, very clear indeed. Now, it is very remarkable that this is so extensively overlooked, continued the time traveller with a slight accession of cheerfulness. Really, this is what is meant by the 4th dimension, though some people who talk about the 4th dimension do not know they mean it. It is only another way of looking at time. There is no difference between time and any of the 3 dimensions of space, except that our consciousness moves along it. But some foolish people have got hold of the wrong side of that idea. You have all heard what they have to say about this 4th dimension? I have not, said the provincial mayor. It is simply this. That space, as our mathematicians have it, is spoken of as having 3 dimensions, which one may call length, breadth, and thickness, and is always definable by reference to 3 planes, each at right angles to the others. But some philosophical people have been asking why 3 dimensions particularly. Why not another direction at right angles to the other 3? And have even tried to construct a 4-dimension geometry. Professor Simon Newcomb was expounding this to the New York Mathematical Society only a month or so ago. You know how on a flat surface, which has only 2 dimensions, we can represent a figure of a 3-dimensional solid, and similarly they think that by models of 3 dimensions they could represent one of 4, if they could master the perspective of the thing. See? I think so, murmured the provincial mayor, and knitting his brows, he lapsed into an introspective state, his lips moving as one who repeats mystic words. Yes, I think I see it now, he said after some time, brightening in a quite transitory manner. Well, I do not mind telling you I have been at work upon this geometry of 4 dimensions for some time. Some of my results are curious. For instance, here is a portrait of a man at 8 years old, another at 15, another at 17, another at 23, and so on. All these are evidently sections, as it were, 3-dimensional representations of his 4-dimension being, which is a fixed and unalterable thing. Scientific people, proceeded the time traveller, after the pause required for the proper assimilation of this, know very well that time is only a kind of space. Here is a popular scientific diagram, a weather record. This line I trace with my finger shows the movement of the barometer. Yesterday it was so high. Yesterday night it fell, then this morning it rose again, and so gently upward to here. Surely the mercury did not trace this line in any of the dimensions of space generally recognized? But certainly it traced such a line, and that line, therefore, we must conclude was along the time dimension. But, said the medical man, staring hard at a coal in the fire, if time is really only a 4th dimension of space, why is it, and why has it always been, regarded as something different, and why cannot we move in time as we move about in the other dimensions of space? The time traveller smiled. Are you so sure we can move freely in space? Right and left we can go, backward and forward freely enough, and men always have done so. I admit we move freely in 2 dimensions, but how about up and down? Gravitation limits us there. Not exactly, said the medical man. There are balloons. But before the balloons, save for spasmodic jumping and the inequalities of the surface, man had no freedom of vertical movement. Still they could move a little up and down, said the medical man. Easier, far easier, down than up. And you cannot move at all in time. You cannot get away from the present moment. My dear sir, that is just where you are wrong. That is just where the whole world has gone wrong. We are always getting away from the present moment. Our mental existences, which are immaterial and have no dimensions, are passing along the time dimension with a uniform velocity from the cradle to the grave. Just as we should travel down if we began our existence 50 miles above the Earth's surface. But the great difficulty is this, interrupted the psychologist. You can move about in all directions of space, but you cannot move about in time. That is the germ of my great discovery. But you are wrong to say that we cannot move about in time. For instance, if I am recalling an incident very vividly, I go back to the instant of its occurrence. I become absent-minded, as you say. I jump back for a moment. Of course, we have no means of staying back for any length of time, any more than a savage or an animal has of staying 6 feet above the ground. But a civilized man is better off than the savage in this respect. He can go up against gravitation in a balloon, and why should he not hope that ultimately he may be able to stop or accelerate his drift along the time dimension, or even turn about and travel the other way? Oh, this, began Philby, is all. Why not? Said the time traveller. It's against reason, said Philby. What reason? Said the time traveller. You can show black is white by argument, said Philby, but you will never convince me. Possibly not, said the time traveller. But now you begin to see the object of my investigations into the geometry of 4 dimensions. Long ago I had a vague inkling of a machine. To travel through time, exclaimed the very young man. That shall travel indifferently in any direction of space and time as the driver determines. Philby contented himself with laughter. But I have experimental verification, said the time traveller. It would be remarkably convenient for the historian, the psychologist suggested. One might travel back and verify the accepted account of the Battle of Hastings, for instance. "Don't you think it would attract attention?" said the medical man. "Our ancestors had no great tolerance for anachronisms. One might get one's Greek from the very lips of Homer and Plato," the very, very young man thought, "in which case they would certainly plough you for the little go. The German scholars have improved Greek so much." "Then there is the future," said the very young man. "Just think. One might invest all one's money, leave it to accumulate at interest, and hurry on ahead." "To discover a society," said I, "erected on a strictly communistic basis." "Of all the wild, extravagant theories," began the psychologist. "Yes, so it seemed to me, and so I never talked of it until—" "Experimental verification," cried I. "You are going to verify that?" "The experiment," cried Philby, who was getting brain-weary. "Let's see your experiment anyhow," said the psychologist, "though it's all humbug, you know." The time-traveller smiled round at us. Then, still smiling faintly, and with his hands deep in his trousers pockets, he walked slowly out of the room, and we heard his slippers shuffling down the long passage to his laboratory. The psychologist looked at us. "I wonder what he's got." "Some sleight-of-hand trick or other," said the medical man, and Philby tried to tell us about a conjurer he had seen at Burslem. But before he had finished his preface, the time-traveller came back, and Philby's anecdote collapsed. Chapter 2. The Machine. I think that at that time none of us quite believed in the time machine. The fact is, the time-traveller was one of those men who are too clever to be believed. You never felt that you saw all round him. You always suspected some subtle reserve, some ingenuity in ambush, behind his lucid frankness. Had Philby shown the model and explained the matter in the time-traveller's words, we should have shown him far less scepticism. For we should have perceived his motives. A pork butcher could understand Philby. But the time-traveller had more than a touch of whim among his elements, and we distrusted him. Things that would have made the fame of a less clever man seemed tricks in his hands. It is a mistake to do things too easily. The serious people who took him seriously never felt quite sure of his deportment. They were somehow aware that trusting their reputations for judgment with him was like furnishing a nursery with eggshell china. So I don't think any of us said very much about time-travelling in the interval between that Thursday and the next, though its odd potentialities ran, no doubt, in most of our minds. Its plausibility, that is, its practical incredibleness, the curious possibilities of anachronism and of utter confusion it suggested. For my own part, I was particularly preoccupied with the trick of the model. That I remember discussing with the medical man, whom I met on Friday at the Linnaean. He said he had seen a similar thing at Tübingen and laid considerable stress on the blowing out of the candle. But how the trick was done, he could not explain. The next Thursday I went again to Richmond. I suppose I was one of the time-traveller's most constant guests, and, arriving late, found 4 or 5 men already assembled in his drawing-room. The medical man was standing before the fire with a sheet of paper in one hand and his watch in the other. I looked round for the time-traveller, and "It's 7:30 now," said the medical man. "I suppose we'd better have dinner?" "Where's—" said I, naming our host. "You've just come? It's rather odd. He's unavoidably detained. He asks me in this note to lead off with dinner at 7 if he's not back. Says he'll explain when he comes." "It seems a pity to let the dinner spoil," said the editor of a well-known daily paper, and thereupon the doctor rang the bell. The psychologist was absent, and the place was laid for 4 only. We sat down to dinner. The Philby substitute was unknown to me. There was a quietness in the room, and the dinner was without zest. The medical man smoked a cigarette and watched the door. The editor began a criticism of the last number of The Nature. I took it up and endeavoured to enliven the conversation. "It's only another of his tricks," said the editor. "He's tricked us before, you know, and then he thinks he's going to explain it all over again next Thursday. It's just a bit of his magic. I suppose the time machine is only a model or a toy or a joke or something of that kind. That's what I want explained. He must be mad or trying to make us mad or playing us for fools somehow. You mark my words, he'll be here in 10 minutes and then—" It was precisely at that moment that the door opened and the time-traveller stood before us. I gave a cry of surprise. "Good heavens! Man, what's the matter?" cried the medical man who saw him first. and the whole tableful turned towards the door. He was in an amazing plight. His coat was dusty and dirty, and smeared with green down the sleeves. His hair disordered, and as it seemed to me greyer, either with dust and dirt, or because its colour had actually changed. His face was ghastly pale, his chin had a brown cut on it, a cut half-healed. His expression was haggard and drawn as by intense suffering. For a moment he hesitated in the doorway, as if he had been dazzled by the light. Then he came into the room. He walked with just such a limp as I have seen in footsore tramps. We stared at him in silence, expecting him to speak. He said not a word, but came painfully to the table and made a motion towards the wine. The editor filled a glass of champagne and pushed it towards him. He drained it, and it seemed to do him good, for he looked round the table, and the ghost of his old smile flickered across his face. "What on earth have you been up to, man?" said the doctor. The time-traveller did not seem to hear. "Don't let me disturb you," he said, with a certain faltering articulation. "I'm all right." He stopped, held out his glass for more, and took it off at a draught. "That's good," he said. His eyes grew brighter, and a faint colour came into his cheeks. His glance flickered over our faces with a certain dull approval, and then went round the warm and comfortable room. Then he spoke again, still as it were feeling his way among his words. "I'm going to wash and dress, and then I'll come down and explain things. Save me some of that mutton. I'm starving for a bit of meat." He looked across at the editor, who was a rare visitor, and hoped he was all right. The editor began a question. "Tell you presently," said the time-traveller. "I'm funny. Be all right in a minute." He put down his glass and walked towards the staircase door. Again I remarked his lameness and the soft padding sound of his footfall, and standing up in my place, I saw his feet as he went out. He had nothing on them but a pair of tattered, blood-stained socks. Then the door closed upon him. I had half a mind to follow, till I remembered how he detested any fuss about himself. For a minute, perhaps, my mind was wool-gathering. Then, "Remarkable behaviour of an eminent scientist," I heard the editor say, thinking in fragments of the oddness of it. He was a serious man, the editor, a rare visitor, but a welcome one, and the medical man took his cue from him. I'm sure the editor regarded it as a case of temporary mental disorder and treated it accordingly. I don't believe he had any idea of the truth of the matter. The fact is, the time-traveller was one of those men who are too clever to be believed. You always suspected some subtle reserve, some ingenuity in ambush, behind his lucid frankness. Chapter 3. The Time-Traveller Returns. I told some of you last Thursday of the principles of the time machine, and showed you the actual thing itself, incomplete in the workshop. There it is now, a little travel-worn, truly, and one of the ivory bars is cracked and a brass rail bent, but the rest of it's sound enough. I expected to finish it on the Friday, but on Friday, when the putting together was nearly done, I found that one of the nickel bars was exactly 1 inch too short, and this I had to get remade, so that the thing was not complete until this morning. It was at 10 o'clock today that the first of all time machines began its career. I gave it a last tap, tried all the screws again, put one more drop of oil on the quartz rod, and sat myself in the saddle. I suppose a suicide who holds a pistol to his skull feels much the same wonder at what will come next as I felt then. I took the starting lever in one hand and the stopping one in the other, pressed the first and almost immediately the second. I seemed to reel. I felt a nightmare sensation of falling, and looking round, I saw the laboratory exactly as before. Had anything happened? For a moment I suspected that my intellect had tricked me. Then I noted the clock. A moment before, as it seemed, it had stood at a minute or so past 10. Now it was nearly 3:30. I drew a breath, set my teeth, gripped the starting lever with both hands and went off with a thud. The laboratory got hazy and went dark. Mrs. Watchett came in and walked, apparently without seeing me, towards the garden door. I suppose it took her a minute or so to traverse the place, but to me she seemed to shoot across the room like a rocket. I pressed the lever over to its extreme position. The night came like the turning out of a lamp, and in another moment came tomorrow. The laboratory grew faint and hazy, then fainter and ever fainter. Tomorrow night came black, then day again, night again, day again, faster and faster still. An eddying murmur filled my ears, and a strange, dumb confusedness descended on my mind. I am afraid I cannot convey the peculiar sensations of time travelling. They are excessively unpleasant. There is a feeling exactly like that one has upon a switchback, of a helpless, headlong motion. I felt the same horrible anticipation, too, of an imminent smash. As I put on pace, night followed day like the flapping of a black wing. The dim suggestion of the laboratory seemed presently to fall away from me, and I saw the sun hopping swiftly across the sky, leaping it every minute, and every minute marking a day. I supposed the laboratory had been destroyed, and I had come into the open air. I had a dim impression of scaffolding, but I was already going too fast to be conscious of any moving things. The slowest snail that ever crawled dashed by too fast for me. The twinkling succession of darkness and light was excessively painful to the eye. Then, in the intermittent darknesses, I saw the moon spinning swiftly through her quarters from new to full, and had a faint glimpse of the circling stars. Presently, as I went on, still gaining velocity, the palpitation of night and day merged into one continuous greyness. The sky took on a wonderful deepness of blue, a splendid luminous colour like that of early twilight. The jerking sun became a streak of fire, a brilliant arch in space, the moon a fainter fluctuating band, and I could see nothing of the stars, save now and then a brighter circle flickering in the blue. The landscape was misty and vague. I was still on the hillside upon which this house now stands, and the shoulder rose above me, grey and dim. I saw trees growing and changing like puffs of vapour, now brown, now green. They grew, spread, shivered, and passed away. I saw huge buildings rise up, faint and fair, and pass like dreams. The whole surface of the earth seemed changed, melting and flowing under my eyes. The little hands upon the dials that registered my speed raced round faster and faster. Presently I noted that the sun belt swayed up and down, from solstice to solstice, in a minute or less, and that consequently my pace was over a year a minute. And minute by minute the white snow flashed across the world, and vanished, and was followed by the bright, brief green of spring. The unpleasant sensations of the start were less poignant now. They merged at last into a kind of hysterical exhilaration. I remarked, indeed, a clumsy swaying of the machine, for which I was unable to account. But my mind was too confused to attend to it, so with a kind of madness growing upon me, I flung myself into futurity. At first I scarce thought of stopping, scarce thought of anything but these new sensations. But presently a fresh series of impressions grew up in my mind, a certain curiosity and therewith a certain dread, until at last they took complete possession of me. What strange developments of humanity, what wonderful advances upon our rudimentary civilization, I thought, might not appear when I came to look nearly into the dim, elusive world that raced and fluctuated before my eyes. I saw great and splendid architecture rising about me, more massive than any buildings of our own time, and yet, as it seemed, built of glimmer and mist. I saw a richer green flow up the hillside, and remain there without changing through 100 years. I saw a huge red building rise up, faint and fair, and pass like a bubble of fire. And then more thickly spread buildings, the houses of a new and wonderful world. I saw all this, but not clearly. The buildings grew and changed and passed again into mist and faintness before my eyes. And then, suddenly, I stopped. It was as if a spring suddenly relaxed. I had come to rest. I saw the sun hopping low in the sky from left to right. To be exact, I should say that the sun appeared stationary, but that the landscape shifted and circled around me. The sky was very dark, and the wind blew keenly. I remarked, too, that the machine was standing on a kind of sloping beach. I saw the sea stretch before me, grey and vast. I seemed to have stopped on the edge of a steep embankment, but at that time I paid little heed to this. I was not afraid, but I found myself exhausted and giddy. I sat and rested for a while, with my hands gripping the sides of the saddle, and stared at the skyline. I was, as I have said, more than a little tired, and I determined to descend and explore. But when I had loosened the levers with a certain precaution, for I was nervous of recurrences of the strange, swift movement, I found the machine would not move. Upon investigation, I found that one of the levers was bent. I sprang off and looked round me. The sky was a dull grey. The landscape seemed vague and confusing. Everything about me was grey and motionless. I stood up and looked at the sea, and then at the beach, and then higher up the hill to see a thing that startled me. That grey thing was moving. It was a great white sphinx of stone, a statue, rudely but very massively carved. Its head was in the air, its back was towards me. It was greatly weather-worn, and that imparted an air of rudeness to its features. But it was evident that the figure was that of a winged creature, human in shape, of course, with one arm upraised, and the figure poised dramatically upon a pedestal of white marble. The wings spread, I judged, 30 feet across the back. I approached it slowly, tingling with emotion, but the thing was lifeless. The pedestal was fixed solidly on a platform of rock. The thing had seemed to move, and yet it was fixed. It was nothing but a statue, big, white, and motionless. I looked at it for a long time, and then made my way down the slope to the sea again. The machine was exactly where I had left it. I shook it, and it remained firm. My time travel had ended, and I stood on the threshold of a new world. Chapter 4. Time Travelling. In another moment we were standing face to face, I and this fragile thing that was flitting down the hillside, a white, monkey-like creature, and its large eyes were pointed at me in astonishment. Then something stirred in my memory, and a chilly feeling came over me. It reminded me of something I had long forgotten. Then I remembered the things that I had read about the future, the things that were imagined by the writers of fantastic stories, and the chilly, grim possibilities that had once made me shiver. And the real thing was before me. Here was the actual creature, the thing of the future. And it was not terrible, not grotesque, not monstrous at all. It was rather pretty and graceful and childlike and peaceful. And then I saw a number of other creatures of the same type emerging from the bushes and approaching us with curious looks. They came around me in a circle, and one of them spoke to me. I didn't understand the words, but the tone was soft and friendly. It sounded like a sweet cooing. Another handed me a garland of flowers, and I took it and put it around my neck. Then one of them gently took my hand and led me down a path, and the others followed, chattering to one another in their strange musical language. We came to a broad avenue paved with huge stone slabs and lined with tall buildings covered in moss and flowering vines. The architecture was unlike anything I had ever seen, elegant, delicate, almost organic in its shapes, and everything was in perfect harmony with the natural beauty of the landscape. There were fountains and pools of clear water and broad stairways of white stone, and the people, if I could call them that, moved with a quiet grace and serenity that was more like a dream than reality. They led me to one of the buildings, and inside I found a great hall filled with soft cushions and beautiful draperies. They brought me fruits and cool drinks, and gestured for me to sit. I tried to speak to them, but they only smiled and shook their heads. It was clear that they did not understand me, nor I them. For a time I simply rested. I was weary from my journey through time, and the softness and peace of the place wrapped around me like a balm. But soon my curiosity awoke again, and I began to explore. I found that the whole area was like a great garden, with winding paths and hidden glades. There were more of the white creatures, and they seemed to live without labour or care. They ate fruits that grew abundantly and drank from the streams. There were no signs of work, no shops, no tools, no weapons. It was as if they lived in a perpetual paradise. But something was wrong. As I watched them more closely, I saw that they were afraid of the dark. As evening fell, they gathered into the buildings and locked the doors. Their smiles faded, and they became quiet and nervous. I asked myself, what did they fear? I remembered the Sphinx, the great white statue I had seen when I arrived, and I remembered that the time machine was still standing near it. I resolved to return to it. But when I reached the place, the machine was gone. I was in a panic. I searched all around, called out, even tried to question the white people, but they only looked at me with blank faces or laughed gently as if I were playing a game. I could get no answer. I searched the pedestal of the Sphinx and found that there was a set of bronze panels set into its base, but they had no handles or seams. They were perfectly smooth and fitted into the stone with such precision that I could not even insert a blade. Yet I was sure that the time machine was hidden behind them. Now I had a new goal, to open those panels and recover the machine. But how? I had no tools, no help, and the white creatures, whom I began to call the Eloi, were too weak and passive to assist me. Yet I did not despair. I resolved to learn all I could about this future world, and in the days that followed I watched and explored, and slowly I began to understand. I found that there were no old people among the Eloi. They all seemed to be young adults, graceful and delicate, like children grown tall. There was no disease, no struggle, no pain, but also no curiosity, no ambition, no memory. They lived in the ruins of a great civilization, a civilization that had once been mighty and wise, but it had decayed. The machines were gone, the knowledge was lost, and the Eloi, inheritors of it all, had become simple and helpless. Yet I still had the sense that something was hidden, that there was a shadow behind the sunshine. I watched them by day, but I also began to watch by night. And then, one night, I saw it. A dark shape moving among the trees. Not an Eloi. It was larger, and it moved differently, furtively. I heard a strange, shuffling sound and a low growl. I crept closer, and then I saw it. Eyes like glowing coals, a grey, hunched form slipping through the shadows. It vanished into a hole in the ground. And the next morning I found that the Eloi would not go near that place. I had discovered the Morlocks. Chapter 5. The Golden Age. In the first place, I must explain that the time machine was standing on a sloping lawn outside the building I have called the White Sphinx, and I had not thought to secure it. At the time I doubted that it was any more than a trick or a clever toy. I had not dreamed of such a thing as being stolen. And it was only after I had tried, and failed, to open the bronze panels at the pedestal that I began to suspect that something had taken it away. The locks of the panels defied me. I could discover no keyhole, no handle, no joint, not even a crack or dent. The thing was as solid as a piece of sculpture. I banged at it with my fists, I kicked it, I tried to liver it with a stone. Nothing moved. And it was then that I began to realize the time machine had been hidden deliberately. Someone or something had taken it. And the only creatures I had seen who might be capable of such an action were those dim shapes I had glimpsed at night. Those strange, silent watchers whom the Eloi feared. I now had two questions before me. First, who were the Morlocks, and where did they live? Second, how could I retrieve the time machine? As I wandered among the ruins of the ancient buildings, observing the Eloi, I gathered more and more evidence that they lived only on the surface and had no knowledge of the underworld. They were indifferent to everything. They had no curiosity, no ambition, and no fear, except of the dark. That fear haunted them. By day they lounged in the sun and played with flowers and fruit, but as night approached they grew anxious. They hurried indoors, shut doors and windows, and gathered together in silence. I had seen it again and again. It was the only sign of dread in their entire existence, and that told me plainly that the Morlocks came out only in the dark. I began to search for the entrances to their world. In several places I found round, well-like openings in the ground with metal covers. One of them I saw open during the day, and a white creature, hairless, pale, with large staring eyes, looked out, then scurried back down. The thing moved like a monkey, and I had a momentary flash of revulsion. I knew then that I must go down into those wells, into the world of the Morlocks, to find my machine. But I did not act immediately. I needed light. I needed weapons. I needed a plan. In the meantime, I made friends with a single Eloi, a girl named Weena. She was smaller than the others, gentler, and strangely more responsive. One day, while exploring near a river, she had slipped and fallen in. I plunged in after her, and though the water was shallow, she was helpless, floundering like a child. I pulled her out and brought her back to the buildings. After that, she followed me everywhere. She brought me flowers, smiled at me, clung to my hand. She slept near me, and though the other Eloi seemed to forget things within hours, Weena remembered. I think she saw in me some strength, some purpose that was missing from her kind, and in her silent way she helped me endure the loneliness of that strange world. While the Eloi played and slept, I explored. I found the remains of an old museum, a great building filled with shattered glass cases and dust. Most of the contents had decayed to nothing, but in one dark corner I found a box of matches, still usable, and in another I discovered two strange camphor-like blocks which burned with a steady white flame. Fire, I had fire. I made a torch and tested the matches. They worked. Now I was ready to go down into the earth. I returned to the well I had marked, waited for daylight, and prepared myself. I tied the camphor to my belt, took my torch and matches, and climbed down into the darkness. The shaft was vertical, and I descended by metal rungs set into the walls. The light faded above me, and a foul smell rose from below. I felt damp air on my face, and then the darkness became absolute. I lit a match, then the torch, and by its flickering glow I saw that I had reached a tunnel. It was wide, with low ceilings, and the floor was littered with dust and bones. Bones of animals and bones of Eloi. The walls were streaked with rust and grime, and the ceiling dripped with moisture. Pipes and wires ran along the walls, remnants of the ancient machinery that must have once powered the upper world. Now it was dead, except for the Morlocks. I moved forward, hearing scuffling sounds ahead of me, and then I saw them. They were hunched, ape-like things with pale grey skin, white hair, and huge, lidless eyes that gleamed in the torchlight. They were frightened of the fire, shrinking from it, making low, guttural noises. I tried to speak to them, but they backed away, watching me with suspicion. I advanced, and they retreated, always just out of reach. They did not attack, but they did not lead me to the machine either. I began to feel the weight of the underground pressing on me, the heat, the stench, the darkness, the silence. I grew dizzy, and the torch was burning low. I turned back, climbed the shaft again, and emerged, gasping into the sunlight. That night I did not sleep. I knew now the truth. The Eloi were not the masters of that world. They were the cattle. The Morlocks were the keepers of the ancient machines, the maintainers of the world's hidden systems, and they preyed upon the Eloi. In that beautiful garden-like world, beneath the soft sky and the crumbling ruins, a terrible balance had been struck. Leisure above, labour below. And now that labour had become hunger. I kept these thoughts from Weena. She slept beside me, her head on my arm, and I stared up at the stars. Somewhere below, in the tunnels, the Morlocks had hidden my machine. I had to find it. I had to escape, but first I had to prepare. I would go down again, this time with fire enough to light my way and to drive the Morlocks back if they tried to stop me. Chapter 6. The Underworld. It may seem odd to you, but it was 2 days before I could follow up the resolve I had made to explore the Underworld. During that time, Weena was with me, and for the most part I was kept busy teaching her to speak and understand a little English. She was bright and quick, and soon began to answer me in her own soft, cooing accents. She was surprisingly clever, and made several attempts to repeat English words after me, which greatly delighted me. But I must confess that I was seriously hampered in my explorations by my anxiety for Weena's safety. If I had been alone, I could have faced the darkness of the underground with more confidence. As it was, I felt constantly torn between the need to retrieve my time machine and the need to protect her. I feared the Morlocks might seize her if I left her alone, and she, poor creature, clung to me with the instinctive terror of her race. At last, however, I devised a plan. I made a small pile of dry twigs and leaves near the shaft where I intended to descend, and set Weena to watch over them. I explained as best I could that she must wait there, and that if I called, she must throw the twigs down the shaft to me so that I might make a fire. Then, with my torch ready and my camphor blocks in my pocket, I descended once more into the well. I went down quickly and silently, my torch flaring and my heart beating faster with every rung. I reached the tunnel floor and advanced cautiously, holding my torch high. The Morlocks scattered before me, their eyes gleaming like fireflies in the dark. They were clearly afraid of the light, but I could hear them gathering in the shadows beyond its reach. I passed through a series of low tunnels and chambers, the walls damp and slippery, the air foul and thick. I began to notice machinery, vast, ancient engines that wheezed and groaned as though still working. There were levers and dials, gears and pistons, all coated in dust and rust. The Morlocks moved among them like phantoms, and I saw that this was their world, a subterranean labyrinth of forgotten technology and industrial decay. Then I came to a larger chamber, lit by a faint blue glow from some unknown source. It was here I saw a great heap of clothing, discarded garments of the Eloi piled like refuse. And then bones, human bones, cracked and charred. I knelt and examined them. There could be no doubt. The Morlocks were not only the keepers of machines, they were also the masters of the Eloi. They raised them, fed them, protected them by day, and hunted them by night. It was a hideous inversion of the old order. The workers had become the rulers, and the rulers had become cattle. A great horror overcame me. I staggered to my feet, and the torch slipped from my hand. It fell and rolled, the flame extinguishing in the wet slime of the floor. In an instant, darkness closed in around me. I heard rustling and whispering, and then soft footsteps approaching. I fumbled for my matches and lit another camphor block. The flare of the white flame drove the Morlocks back, hissing and snarling. I turned and fled, running blindly through the tunnels, the light flickering wildly in my hand. I reached the shaft and shouted for Weena. She did not answer. In a panic, I began to climb. The camphor block was burning out, and I could feel the darkness pressing closer. I climbed faster, my muscles aching, my hands slipping on the damp metal. At last I emerged into the open air. It was night. Weena was gone. I called her name again and again. I ran through the fields and woods, searching desperately. At last, just as dawn was breaking, I found her crouched beneath a tree, shivering and crying softly. She ran to me and clung to me, and I held her close, my heart filled with a strange mixture of relief and despair. I had seen the truth of the future. The Eloi were the remnants of the aristocracy, grown weak and helpless. The Morlocks were the descendants of the working class, hardened and brutal. The beautiful surface world was only a mask, hiding the horror beneath. The time machine was still lost, and I had no way of escaping this nightmare age. But I had not given up hope. I had seen the pedestal of the White Sphinx. I was now convinced that the Morlocks had hidden the machine inside it. I resolved to make one final effort to recover it. I would go there with Weena. I would build a fire and keep watch through the night. And if the Morlocks came, I would be ready. Chapter 7. The Forest Fire. Weena I had rescued from her fear and helplessness beneath the stars, and from that moment she never left my side. She was, in a way, the only comfort I found in that strange world, childlike, affectionate, and trusting. But as I made preparations for my final attempt to recover the time machine, I realized that I could not bring her with me into danger again. My plan was simple. I would go to the pedestal of the White Sphinx during the night, armed with matches, camphor, and a crude weapon I had fashioned from a broken iron bar. I would force the bronze doors or wait for the Morlocks to open them. In preparation, I gathered branches and dry undergrowth from the surrounding woods. I built a small camp in the forest, and Weena and I spent the day there. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a fire, and together we sat beside it. She watched the flames with wonder, and I saw in her face something of the Eloi's ancestral fear of darkness and the Morlocks that came with it. When the fire burned low, I added more wood, and we lay down to rest. I did not intend to sleep, but exhaustion overcame me, and I awoke with a start to find the fire nearly out. All around was darkness. I stirred the embers, added twigs, and the blaze grew again. Weena slept beside me, her small hand in mine. Then I heard it. A soft, pattering sound in the forest. I leapt to my feet and grabbed the iron bar. Eyes glinted in the shadows. The Morlocks had come. I snatched up the box of matches and lit a camphor block. The brilliant white flame flared, and I saw pale figures retreating into the trees. I threw a burning branch into the undergrowth, and it caught fire instantly. The flames spread, feeding on the dry leaves and dead wood. The forest began to burn. With Weena in my arms, I ran. The fire roared behind us, lighting the night with flickering red and orange. Smoke billowed through the trees, and the Morlocks shrieked in fear and confusion. I stumbled through the undergrowth, branches tearing at my clothes, Weena clinging to me. At last I found an open space and collapsed, gasping for breath. The fire was still spreading, and through the smoke and heat I could see figures fleeing in all directions. I turned to look for Weena, but she was gone. I called her name, searched the ground, the trees, the shadows. There was no sign of her. Whether she had slipped from my grasp during the flight or been taken by the Morlocks, I never knew. But I never saw her again. When the fire burned itself out, I made my way to the White Sphinx. The pedestal stood blackened and scorched, but the bronze doors were open. I approached cautiously, iron bar in hand. The interior was dark, but I could see the familiar shape of the time machine resting on a platform. I stepped inside and heard the sound of footsteps behind me. The Morlocks had followed. I turned and saw them, pale and silent, emerging from the shadows. I struck a match, but the flame flickered and died. I lit another, and one more. My last match flared in my hand, casting a brief circle of light. Then I sprang into the saddle of the machine, pulled the levers, and flung myself forward into time. The last I saw of the Morlocks was their blank, inhuman faces lit by the flare of my escape. Then the world dissolved into light and motion, and I was once more adrift in the river of time. I do not know how far I went. I stopped only once, in the far future, where the sun hung huge and red in the sky and the earth was silent and cold. The sea had frozen, and the air was thin and lifeless. Strange, slow-moving creatures crawled on the shore, and great crabs scuttled over the rocks. I watched them for a time, then travelled further still, until even these had vanished, and the sun flickered like a dying ember. Then, with a final effort, I reversed the levers and returned to you. Chapter 8. Explanation. I must have slept for a time. My memory is vague as to that. I awoke a little cold, but with a renewed sense of confidence and energy. I determined to go back to the White Sphinx and see if I could find the time machine and escape. I looked at the landscape. The palace of green porcelain seemed further off than I had thought. I began walking in a direction towards the White Sphinx, but in the dense undergrowth I soon lost my bearings. I heard movements among the bushes, sounds that seemed to suggest retreating footsteps. I approached a bush where something had stirred. I was determined to face whatever was there. With a sudden dash and a slight noise, something rushed out of the shrubbery and ran away. It was a Morlock. I chased it recklessly. It turned into a narrow passage between rocks and vanished. I stopped, breathing hard. The Morlocks were afraid of me now, clearly. I felt encouraged. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a sobbing, moaning voice, not loud but close by. I turned and went cautiously in the direction of the sound. There, between two bushes, I found Weena. She had been frightened by the Morlocks and lost her way. She was overjoyed to see me. Her delight and her trust filled me with a certain shame. I had come near abandoning her. We set off together and in a while came to the edge of the forest. I resolved to rest there and try to build a fire to keep the Morlocks away. Weena was tired and frightened, and I gathered wood to make a blaze. I had my matches and the camphor I had found earlier. I built a small fire, and the light seemed to give her confidence. She fell asleep by the flame, and I sat beside her, watching the flickering shadows and listening to the night. I was drowsy, but I dared not sleep. I began to think of the Morlocks, of the Underworld, and of the time when I might recover my machine. A strange feeling stole over me, a sense of unreality, of dream. The fire crackled, and Weena murmured in her sleep. Suddenly I heard footsteps, soft, many-footed, stealthy. I seized a piece of wood from the fire and sprang up. Pale figures scattered in the darkness. I flung the blazing branch at them and heard cries of pain and fear. Then I lit more camphor and flung it into the fire. The flames leapt high. I had driven them back, but I knew they would return. I piled more wood on the fire and resolved to keep it going until morning. I sat by the blaze, holding Weena close, and as I looked into the fire, I tried to understand what had become of man. I had seen the Eloi, beautiful, delicate, weak. I had seen the Morlocks, dull, pale, brutish, and I began to understand the terrible outcome of our industrial society. The Eloi were the lords of the surface, once powerful, now fallen into helplessness. The Morlocks were the labourers, driven underground, now the masters of the night. The balance of nature had shifted. The future of humanity was a grim parody of our present. I shivered, though the fire was warm. I held Weena closer. I resolved that if I could recover my machine, I would return to my own time and warn the world. But first I had to survive the night. Chapter 9. The Morlocks. I cannot sleep, and so I am writing in the journal I brought with me. It is night once again, and the forest around me is dark. I am keeping the fire alight. Weena lies near me, asleep, her head resting against my arm. She is so small and delicate, like a child, and yet her presence brings me great comfort. I had meant to return to the White Sphinx today, but I did not. The events of the last night have unnerved me. Last night, after I had written the last entry, I sat watching the fire until it grew low. I dared not sleep. I heard faint rustlings in the brush beyond the circle of light. The Morlocks were out there, waiting. I threw another branch onto the fire and listened to the crackling flame. Weena stirred in her sleep. Then I heard something behind me. I turned quickly and saw a pair of eyes, luminous and pale, staring at me through the darkness. I snatched a burning stick from the fire and hurled it toward the shape. There was a cry and the sound of retreating footsteps. I stood up and fed more wood into the fire. The Morlocks would not take me unawares. Eventually exhausted, I slept. It was only for a short while, for I awoke with the sense of something moving. The fire had burned low. I jumped up and looked around. Weena was still asleep. There was nothing in sight, but I was filled with a terrible sense of being watched. I waited for morning, and as the sky lightened, the fear slowly passed. When the sun was fully up, I felt myself again. I left Weena sleeping and went to explore nearby. I found a narrow path leading down into a ravine. The sides were steep and the ground was soft and damp. As I followed the path, I came upon a round iron trapdoor, like those I'd seen before. This one was open. I looked around cautiously. There was no sign of life. I peered into the hole. A metal ladder led downward, into blackness. The stench from below was foul. I hesitated, but my determination returned. If I was to recover the time machine, I must understand the Morlocks' world. I descended. The shaft was narrow and deep, and the air grew hotter as I went down. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a tunnel. The walls were covered with grime, and pipes ran along them. The floor was littered with bones, small bones, fragile like those of birds, or Eloi. I lit one of my matches and proceeded slowly. The tunnel opened into a large chamber. There were machines here, great, rusting engines that still moved with a faint clanking rhythm. The light of the match flickered, and I saw shapes moving in the shadows. The Morlocks. They were pale and hairless, with large eyes that reflected the matchlight. Their skin was white, almost luminous, and their limbs long and spindly. They hissed and chattered softly as they watched me. I held up the match, and they backed away. I took a step forward, and they scattered into the darkness. I moved through the chamber, searching for any sign of the time machine. But it was not there. I found instead a heap of clothing, torn and blood-stained. Among the rags I saw the remnants of the soft tunics the Eloi wore. I turned away in horror. So, this was what they had become. The Eloi were no longer masters. They were food. The Morlocks raised them like cattle, allowed them to live in peace by day, and hunted them by night. It was a terrible revelation. I turned to leave. The match burned out, and I was plunged into darkness. I groped for another match, but my hands were trembling. I lit it and saw the Morlocks closing in. They were all around me, silent and watching. I ran. I do not remember how I reached the ladder. I remember the scraping of my boots on the metal rungs, the cold hands grabbing at my legs, and the blinding light of the sun as I burst from the hole. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. Weena was there, frightened but safe. I held her close and swore I would never descend again. Now, as I sit by the fire and listen to the sounds of the forest, I know what I must do. Tomorrow, I will return to the White Sphinx. I believe the time machine is hidden there, behind the bronze panels. I will find a way to open them. I must. For if I cannot, I will be trapped here forever, in a world that has forgotten its past and devoured its future. Chapter 10. When night came about, 8 or 9 in the morning, I came to the same seat I had visited on my first exploration. I resolved to mount the crest of a brae and survey the country. As I went up the hill, I looked back. I saw the sea in the distance, stretching like a lake under the blue sky, and the river running across the plain. The landscape was grey and monotonous. As I climbed, Weena remained close at my side. The forest was behind us, and a great building that I had not noticed before appeared on the horizon. I came upon a small ruin with columns and a crumbling stair, and we sat there to rest. I tried to piece together the puzzle of this future world. The Eloi were gentle, frail, and had no need for struggle. Everything they needed seemed to be provided. But below them, in the dark tunnels, lived the Morlocks, the true masters of the world. I had a new theory. The Eloi were the remnants of the upper classes, living in ease above ground. The Morlocks, descendants of the working class, had been driven underground by necessity. Over thousands of generations, they had evolved into something different. And now the balance had shifted. The Eloi were dependent like livestock, and the Morlocks were their keepers and their predators. As I sat and thought, the sky became overcast. A cold wind began to blow, and I realized night was approaching. I gathered some dry branches and made a small fire as I had done before. Weena sat near it, watching the flames. I meant to sleep a little, for I was tired, but fear kept me awake. I thought of the time machine, still hidden behind the bronze panels of the White Sphinx. As darkness fell, the fire became more important. The Morlocks would come. I threw on more wood and sat close beside Weena. Then, suddenly, I heard a low rustling in the brush. I jumped to my feet and seized a burning branch. I saw pale figures moving in the shadows. I swung the branch and they scattered. Then a terrible thing happened. The wind, which had been blowing steadily, caught the edge of the fire. The dry grass ignited and a sheet of flame raced away into the forest. In a moment, trees were ablaze. The fire roared and crackled, lighting the night with an orange glow. Smoke filled the air, and the Morlocks fled from the light. I turned to Weena. She was gone. I called her name again and again, running through the smoke and heat. I stumbled and fell. I was blind and choking. A tree crashed down near me, and I barely escaped. I searched for her until the fire burned itself out, but I never saw her again. At dawn, exhausted and heartbroken, I returned to the White Sphinx. The bronze panels were open. I entered the pedestal and found the time machine inside. I rushed forward, but as I did, I heard a sound behind me. The bronze panels closed with a clang. I was trapped. Pale figures moved in the shadows. The Morlocks had set a trap. I was surrounded. I struck a match and lit the lamp on the machine. The light drove them back for a moment. I jumped into the saddle and pulled the levers. They rushed at me, clawing and grabbing. I felt their hands on my arms and face. Then the machine leaped forward in time. I was free. I saw the world rush past me in a blur. The sun rose and set in a flickering dance. The sky changed colour. Buildings crumbled and vanished. Forests grew and died. The sea moved in and out. Mountains rose and fell. I stopped once, far in the future. The sun was larger and redder. The air was thin and cold. Strange, crab-like creatures moved slowly on a silent shore. I watched them for a while, then continued forward. The earth grew colder. The sun dimmed. Snow fell. At last, I returned to my own time. I found myself again in my laboratory, the time machine dusty and still. I was back, but changed. I had seen the end of man. I had seen the future. And now I sit and tell my story. What will you make of it? That is for you to decide. Chapter 11. Back to the Present. I have already told you of the sickness and confusion that comes with time travelling. And this time I was not seated properly in the saddle, but sideways and in an unstable fashion. For an indefinite time I clung to the machine as it swayed and vibrated, swam through eternity, as it seemed to me. The flapping and fluttering of the impact of events filled my ears. I saw nothing clearly. Then I saw the sun jumping from horizon to horizon. The sky darkened and brightened. Trees grew, blossomed, faded and vanished. Buildings rose up and fell. New cities replaced old, and then, farther and farther into the future, I saw a darkening earth and a dying sun. Suddenly the jerking motion ceased. I pressed the lever to stop. I had come back to the present, at least to what I thought was my present. The laboratory swam back into view. I was on my feet before the machine had fully stopped. The room looked the same, though perhaps a little dustier. The sun outside cast a beam through the shuttered window. I stumbled away from the machine, trembling and weak. The house was strangely silent. I went to the door and listened. The hum of the city outside reassured me. I opened the door and stepped into the familiar corridor. Everything seemed normal. I heard voices in the distance, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the soft ticking of the hall clock. The contrast with the world I had left was so great, so sudden, that I could hardly believe in my adventure. I returned to the laboratory and sat beside the time machine. I placed my hand upon it to convince myself that it was real. I thought of Weena, of the Eloi, of the Morlocks, of the far future I had seen. I thought of the decaying moon, of the red sun hanging in the sky, of the silent sea and the desolate beach. I shuddered. I stood up and walked to the dining room, where the guests were still waiting. I must have looked wild, for they rose to greet me with exclamations. They bombarded me with questions. Where had I been? What had happened? Was I ill? I have had a most astonishing time, I told them, and then I asked for food and drink. I was famished. While I ate, they watched me in silence. Then I began my tale, and that is the story I told them. Of course, they did not believe me. They laughed and joked. Only one or two were silent, thoughtful. I could see the doubt in their eyes, the incredulity. Yet the time machine stood there, silent, solid, proof of what I claimed. Later that night, after they had gone, one guest returned. He was a quiet man, a believer in science. He asked to see the machine. I showed it to him. He touched the levers, examined the framework, questioned me carefully. Still, he said little. He shook my hand, said good night and left. Now I sit alone. I am tired. My mind drifts back to that far world. I wonder what became of Weena. I wonder whether the Eloi still live, whether the Morlocks still crawl beneath the earth. The future is not as we imagine it, not golden, not perfect. It is a fading world, a dying race. But I have seen it. I have travelled through time. I have looked upon the end of man. Chapter 12. 2 more days. Then I tried to assure myself of the absolute truth of my story. I had come back to this world of ours, the world of the 19th century, and yet I was still haunted by the memory of that time I had so lately left. The story was so incredible, the telling of it so difficult, that I felt as though I were trying to communicate a dream. They did not believe me. My audience seemed deeply interested, but they did not believe me. The editor raised objections. What was this time machine like? He asked. Describe it. What did it look like? And I told him. The psychologist tried to explain the phenomena away. The medical man asked whether I had not simply dozed and dreamed while seated in my laboratory. The very young man suggested that the entire story was an elaborate hoax. Only the silent man with the beard seemed to ponder it seriously. He asked few questions, but looked at me with thoughtful eyes. Still, he said nothing to confirm belief or disbelief. After some time, the guests left, joking as they went. I remained in the laboratory, alone with the machine, staring at it in silence. The next morning I rose early and went into the garden. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the world looked fresh and green. I was struck by the contrast. I had seen this same earth turned desolate, silent and cold. The vision haunted me. I thought of Weena, of the gentle Eloi, of the ghastly Morlocks, of the dying sun, of the great crabs crawling on a lonely shore. I returned to the house and found my visitor waiting, the silent man from the night before. He asked quietly, "Is it true?" And I replied, "Yes." I showed him the time machine again. He examined it closely. He said I should like to see the future with my own eyes. And I told him that perhaps he might. That day passed quietly. I wrote down my account while the memories were still vivid. That is the narrative I have just read to you. On the following morning, I entered the laboratory shortly after breakfast. My visitor came to say goodbye, and I told him to wait. "I am going," I said, "on a little trip. I shall return shortly." I stepped into the time machine, turned the levers, and vanished. That was 3 years ago. He has never returned. I have waited. I have kept the laboratory as it was. The dust gathers on the time machine. No one has touched it. Sometimes I wonder where he went. Did he return to Weena, to the Eloi and the Morlocks? Did he go forward beyond the end of man, to witness the final silence of the earth? Or did he find some new beginning, a world unspoiled by the errors of his own time? No one knows, but this I know. He was a true explorer, a seeker of truth. And perhaps, even now, he travels through time, learning what none of us may ever know. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the stars. If you enjoyed this audiobook, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new adventure. Explore more science fiction stories right here on Nebula Narratives.